If you have a Bible this morning, I want to invite you to turn with me to Matthew chapter 24. Today we're going to be in Matthew chapter 24, a chapter that we began last week, but we are finishing this week. It's a chapter in which Jesus is speaking to his disciples as he sits on the Mount of Olives, which overlooks the city of Jerusalem. It's often called the Olivet Discourse because of where Jesus and the disciples are seated on the Mount of Olives. And it's a well-known passage because Jesus is speaking mostly about future events. As I mentioned last week, he is speaking about two events primarily, it seems. He began by speaking about the way that the temple was going to one day be destroyed. The disciples, they asked Jesus about this happening, this temple being destroyed, but then they also said about his return, about the end of the age, probably because in their mind, these two were going to be perhaps one event. But Jesus actually speaks about two different events. Jesus speaks about the destruction of the city of Jerusalem and the temple, which we now know happened in the year 70 AD. But Jesus also speaks about his return and the end of the age, which we know, living 2,000 years later, we still await. And I mentioned last week that it can be really hard at times to determine which event Jesus is speaking about because he is not always really clear. In fact, this week I was reading a number of commentaries. I was listening to some of my favorite preachers. By the way, if you have a favorite preacher besides me, just know I'm not offended. I'm not even my own favorite preacher. I turn to others to listen to them. I found that as I listened to different people that I trust, read from different people who know more than me, it seemed like none of them agreed on exactly how to interpret this passage. Some of the details were always parts of discrepancy amongst these different scholars and pastors and preachers. And so as we read this morning, we're going to try to talk about how we work through some of that. But even as we begin to read, I just want to call into mind what we said last week, which is I believe Jesus is giving this instruction to his disciples right then, and now to us through his word that's been preserved for us for a purpose. And the purpose is not just that we would be smarter Christians or that we would have charts and timelines of how to work out the end times. I think Jesus is giving these things to his disciples and to us that we might wait well for his return, that we might be people who would continue to follow him and continue to live on the mission that he has given us, that we would not be led astray as we talked about last week, but we would be faithful in what he has called us to. So let us keep that as our main focus, even as we read this passage this morning. We're going to be in Matthew 24, starting in verse 15. And I'm going to read all the way to the end of the chapter, which is a long passage, but verses 15 through 51. Jesus says, "So when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let the one who is on the housetop not go down to take what is in his house, and let the one who is in the field not turn back to take his cloak. And alas for women who are pregnant, and for those who are nursing infants in those days. Pray that your flight may not be in winter or on a Sabbath. For then there will be great tribulation, such has not been from the beginning of the world until now, no, and never will be. And if those days had not been cut short, no human being would be saved. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. Then if anyone says to you, 'Look, here's the Christ,' or 'There he is,' do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and perform great signs and wonders so as to lead astray, if possible, even the elect. See, I have told you beforehand. So if they say to you, 'Look, he is in the wilderness,' do not go out. If they say, 'Look, he is in the inner rooms,' do not believe it. For as the lightning comes from the east and shines as far as the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather. Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man. Then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send out his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. From the fig tree, learn its lesson. As soon as the branch becomes tender and puts out its leaves, you know that summer is near. So also, when you see all these things, you know that he is near, at the very gates. Truly, I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. But concerning that day and hour, no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father only. For as were the days of Noah, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. For as in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day when Noah entered the ark. And they were unaware until the flood came and swept them all away. So will be the coming of the Son of Man. Then two men will be in the field. One will be taken and one left. Two women will be grinding at the mill. One will be taken and one left. Therefore, stay awake, for you do not know on what day your Lord is coming. But know this, that if the master of the house had known in what part of the night the thief was coming, he would have stayed awake and would not have let his house be broken into. Therefore, you also must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour you do not expect. Who then is the faithful and wise servant, whom his master has set over his house to give them their food at the proper time? Blessed is that servant whom his master will find so doing when he comes. Truly, I say to you, he will set him over all his possessions. But if that wicked servant says to himself, my master is delayed, and begins to beat his fellow servants and eats and drinks with the drunkards, the master of that servant will come on a day he does not expect him, and at an hour he does not know, and will cut him in pieces and put him with the hypocrites. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Perhaps you can see why so many people disagree on how to interpret this passage. There's a lot of details, a lot of prophecy that Jesus is speaking, a lot of discrepancy over when things will take place or what has already been fulfilled and what is to still be fulfilled. You know, as I was thinking about it, I found that in those different pastors I listened to and those different scholars I read, many of them were quick to take a pretty hard stance to say, here's the proper interpretation of these verses. What I find kind of interesting is that for hundreds and even thousands of years, Christians who believe the Bible, Christians who love Jesus and seek to follow him, still seem to disagree about what is the proper interpretation. So for better or worse, it's always been hard for me to say, here's the definite interpretation that I think you should take. Now, I've done my study and I have my beliefs and my convictions, but here's been the kind of principle that's come to my mind. There's an old saying, I don't know if you've heard this before, but it'll be up on the screen. It's a general saying that I think is helpful for Christians, not just about things to do with the end times, but in general. It says, in essentials, unity. In non-essentials, liberty. In all things, charity. This is a saying that's often attributed to St. Augustine, although there's really no proof that he ever said it. I think the first time we ever see it recorded was by a German theologian in what was called the 30 Years' War. But the guiding principle is that in those things that seem to be essential to our faith, those things that are essential to the gospel, we should have unity as God's people. In those things that the Bible is really clear on, we as God's people need to agree on and be unified on. But then there are those things that maybe are not essential. It doesn't mean they're not important. Doesn't mean that they're not interesting, but maybe it means that our faith is not built upon those things. In those things, in the non-essentials, we should have liberty, meaning maybe a freedom to agree to disagree, an understanding as why we would interpret those things differently. But in all these things, we should have charity, meaning we should treat each other with grace and kindness, even as we debate different positions. I find this to be a really helpful principle about most issues, but I think it's really especially important and helpful when it comes to things of the end times. But the way that this principle and this kind of guiding truth can sometimes fall short is you have to make a determination. Well, what is essential and what is non-essential? In other words, where should there be liberty and where should there be unity? When you talk just broadly about the Christian faith, you'll come to many different answers. Sometimes people would say, oh, that's not essential. We could just agree to disagree on that, even though the Bible seems to speak really clear about that issue. And so this morning, what I want to do is we look at this passage and consider what Jesus is teaching us about future events, whether those be future events that took place already in AD 70 in Jerusalem or future events that we still await. I want to try to ask the question, well, where should we have liberty? Where should we be okay to agree to disagree? Maybe even within our church, we would have different opinions or beliefs about how to interpret certain passages, including this one. But where must we have unity? In other words, where is Jesus so clear that we can't debate these things? We can't disagree over these things. We must be unified about these truths. But then lastly, I really just want to ask the question, well, so what? What's the application to all this? I'll admit that this sermon's probably going to be a little bit more teaching and informational than I would often like sermons to be. I would always hope that our sermons are not just informational, but transformational, that God's word is moving us to do something, but we need some teaching from this. But I hope that by the end of it, we will at least begin to see, here is how we begin to apply this to our lives. And so that's how we'll try to walk through this. We won't go verse by verse, but I just want to consider where should we have liberty? Where must we have unity? And then how do we actually apply this? So where should we have liberty on passages like this one, especially as Jesus is talking about future events? Well, in my opinion, I think we should have liberty on the details of timing and events. When we think about this passage and a lot of different debate about those things that are what we would often call the end times, or the big word for that is eschatology, I think that there should be liberty when it comes to the details of timing and events. In other words, the details of when prophecies were fulfilled or when they will be fulfilled in the future. And based on what you believe about those fulfillments and those timings, it's probably going to shape the way that you believe that certain events will take place, how the end times, the return of Jesus might look. And there's going to be some disagreement. So let me at least try to show you how we might come to different interpretations and why I think there should be some liberty in this passage. Most people, I think, by the time you get to the middle of the passage, to the end, when Jesus is really calling his people to a specific action, I don't think there's much debate. Most of the debate seems to happen in the first part of the passage, when Jesus speaks about the abomination of desolation in the holy place, when he talks about a time of tribulation, when he talks about, after the tribulation, his return. So let me just kind of start there in the middle of the passage and work our way backwards to see a little bit about how certain people interpret this passage. So look with me at verse 30. Jesus says, "Then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man. And then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory." Jesus goes on to speak about in verse 31 about how he's going to gather up the elect from the four winds, from the corners of the earth, if you will. So most people, I think if you were to read that, would probably say, this seems to be speaking about the return of our King Jesus. This seems to speak about Jesus' second coming. Now, surprisingly, you will find some people even debate that, and they think maybe this is speaking about something else. But let's take it for granted, or maybe let's just assume here that Jesus in verse 30 is speaking about his return, because it seems to be that's what he's saying. Well, then if you just back up into verse 29, so go back one verse. He says, "Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken." Now, different people disagree on how literal this is going to happen. These things are going to literally take place. This is what we'd often refer to as apocalyptic language, borrowed from Old Testament prophets. There's so many Old Testament references in here that we don't even have the time to probably pull out this morning. But Jesus is certainly using apocalyptic language to speak about this time of his return. But you'll notice in verse 29, right there at the beginning, he frames it that it's going to happen immediately after the tribulation of those days. So then people would say, well, what is the tribulation of those days? Well, back up to verse 21. You could read more about the tribulation in the other verses, but in verse 21, It says, for then there will be great tribulation, such has not been from the beginning of the world until now, no, and never will be. So many people, I think, whenever they get to verse 30 and they hear Jesus talking about his return, and they see in verse 29, it's going to happen immediately after the tribulation of those days. Then they go back to verse 21 and they would say, so there's going to be a great tribulation right before Jesus returns, right? And he says it's going to be a great tribulation that's never happened before. Never will there be anything like it. So many people would say this seems to be a great tribulation right before Jesus returns. And of course, it's not just this passage, many other cross references we could go to. You go to the book of Revelation, there's many places that speak about a tribulation that's going to happen perhaps in the future or maybe has already taken place. Sometimes people will say, well, it's going to be maybe 7 years before Jesus returns, this time of great tribulation. So you can see how certain people would think that Jesus is mostly speaking in this passage about future events of his second coming. So then you'd have to back up all the way to verse 15. Let's go back to where we started here. If these people are reading this passage and seeing that this is all about Jesus' second coming, then when they come to verse 15 and it says, so when you see the abomination of desolation spoken by the prophet Daniel, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. And you think, boy, the reader doesn't understand right now. What is he talking about? So it's going to depend on how you've been reading this passage, right? So most people, they would recognize this is definitely a prophecy by the prophet Daniel, right? That's what Jesus says here. The abomination of desolation taking place in the holy place. So what it seems is that there's going to be something that happens in the holy place, which most people would say that seems to be the temple, the holy of holies in the temple. There's going to be something so despicable that's going to be like an abomination in the holy place. And it was prophesied by Daniel. And in fact, you can find that prophecy in Daniel chapter 11, verse 31. You could just maybe make a note of it in your notes if you want, but I'll read it for you. It says that Daniel says in Daniel 11:31, forces from him shall appear and profane the temple and fortress, and they shall take away the regular burnt offering, and they shall set up the abomination that makes desolate. So here's a prophecy from Daniel saying at some point, someone's going to come in and remove the normal sacrificial offering being offered in the temple, and they are going to make an abomination of this holy place. Now, most people would agree that in part, this prophecy was fulfilled actually before Jesus even came. There was a time in between the Old Testament and the New Testament, a time which we don't always hear a lot about, but we know there's important Jewish history that happened during this time. As the temple had been rebuilt, there was a group called the Maccabees and their revolt, and there was a man named Antiochus Epiphanes who stood in the temple that had been rebuilt, and he sacrificed a pig on the altar there in the Holy of Holies. Now you can imagine what kind of abomination that is to the people of God. Pigs were some of the most unclean animals, not to be sacrificed to God. But here he is in the holy place offering this unclean animal as a sacrifice to pagan gods, not to the one true God. So most people would say, well, that seems to have been fulfilled in part, but Jesus says it's going to happen again. So the question is, well, when does the abomination of desolation take place? Well, if you're someone who's been reading the passage and thinking, well, this seems to all be referring to Jesus' second coming, then most likely I think you're going to read verse 15 and think that this is still going to be something that happens in the future. So you'll find some Christians who I think are Bible-believing Christians, people who love Jesus and the gospel, who think that the abomination of desolation prophecy is still going to take place maybe at some point in the future. Maybe they believe a temple is going to get rebuilt in Jerusalem, and there's going to be something that desecrates that temple. And there's going to be this unfolding of what Jesus is speaking about here that will lead to a tribulation and the return of Jesus. In fact, I was raised by people who believed and interpreted this passage this way. And I would say, I think that I see the validity in the way that they're reading and understanding these truths of the end times. Now, as I've read and studied it, I would come to a different interpretation of these particular verses. I think when Jesus is speaking about the abomination of desolation, he's not talking about something that will happen in the future. I think he is talking about something that happened in the year 70 AD when the temple was destroyed. When the Romans came and destroyed Jerusalem and destroyed the temple, they profaned the temple as they did so. There were many sacrificial offerings offered in abominable or unclean ways that would have desecrated that holy place. And that's why I think Jesus gives such specific directions in those following verses. You notice how Jesus is speaking directly to people who are in Judea there? He says, if you're in Judea during this time, flee to the mountains. He says, alas, for those women who are pregnant or nursing because of how hard it's going to be for them to flee with a child. And pray it's not on the winter or the Sabbath because that makes travel even more difficult. I think that's very specific language to people who were probably living in Jerusalem or that region at the time that it was destroyed. I think when Jesus is talking about a tribulation that's happening, I think he's probably talking about one that the people experienced in those days. You know, the sacking of Jerusalem by the Romans was a really terrible thing. They had surrounded the city for months and cut off supply lines. They did not just destroy the temple, they destroyed the whole city of Jerusalem, slaughtering people. In fact, this past week, I just happened to be listening to a podcast on, it was some historians talking about the fall of the Aztec Empire, talking about how those Spanish conquistadors had come and sacked the Aztec Empire, and Cortez and his men were so brutal in taking over the capital city of the Aztecs. And the historians even said this was like a shadow that had been cast about 1,500 years before when the Romans had destroyed Jerusalem. Perhaps Jesus is using some strong language about how bad this tribulation will be, but perhaps that tribulation was that bad, that those people experienced really harsh violence and persecution as their city is destroyed. Now, I'm moving really quickly through all this, but perhaps you at least could see why maybe we need some liberty on all this. Because it is really hard to determine which interpretation is correct, and I think each one runs into some problems, or at least some difficulties in consideration. In the interpretation I'm sharing about that I believe now, I think you have questions about what does Jesus mean that immediately after the tribulation of those days, he's going to return? That leads to some questions in interpretation. But I think there's many questions on the other side about there being a temple and him saying this generation will not pass until all these things have taken place. So forgive me for giving you such a brief overview of eschatology, but this is why I think we need liberty. Why I think that it's okay to disagree on certain details of timing and events. But I think there are some things that are really clear in this passage that there should not be liberty on, there should be unity on. I think Jesus seeks to underline a couple of truths that we want to make sure we walk away with clarity today. So the question is, well, where should we have unity? I want to offer you 3 points from what Jesus says here, 3 truths that I think we as God's people need to be unified around. The first is that Christ's return will be unmistakable. When Jesus does come back, again, Jesus began by talking about the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, and that led to questions not just of the temple being destroyed, but the end of the age and Jesus' return. So as Jesus speaks about all these things, one of the things he seems to really want his disciples to know is that when he comes back, there will be no mistaking it. Nobody's going to have to tell you that Jesus has returned. Everyone will know. This is something he began last week at the beginning of chapter 24, when he spoke about how other people will rise up and claim to be the Christ or claim to be the Messiah. But do not be fooled, because you'll know when I return. He continues on in the same thing here. Verse 23, he says, if anyone says to you, look, here's the Christ, or there he is, do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will arise, perform great signs and wonders, so as to lead astray, if possible, even the elect. Jesus is saying here that persecution, tribulation will come for God's people. But not only those things, but even deception. The deception will come towards God's people. The enemy will seek to deceive with false prophets and false teachers, performing even great signs and wonders, trying to lead if possible, even those who are God's people. He continues, he says, don't be surprised by this. I've told you beforehand in verse 25. Verse 26, so if they say to you, look, he's in the wilderness, do not go out. If they say, look, he's in the inner rooms, do not believe it. For as lightning comes from the east and shines as far as the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather. I think what Jesus is saying here is, don't be mistaken by people telling you that Jesus has come back or the end has come, because it's going to be very clear when Jesus returns. He says it's going to be as clear as when lightning goes from the east all the way to the west. Some people have read a lot into this verse thinking that's the way Jesus is going to come back. He's going to come from the east to the west. I don't really even know what that means. I think what Jesus is saying here is when he comes back, it's going to be as clear as lightning shooting across the sky. When he comes back, the signs are going to be so clear, it's going to be like vultures around a corpse. Maybe you've been driving down a road, maybe kind of outside the city, in the desert somewhere, and you've seen kind of vultures near something. Well, nobody has to tell you what's there. You know it's roadkill, right? Like you know what's there because the signs are so clear. He says, nobody's going to have to tell you that I'm coming back because my return will be unmistakable. It's going to be seen by everybody. To revisit the verses we kind of started with in verse 29, immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened. The moon will not give its light. The stars will fall from heaven and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man. Then all the tribes of the earth will mourn. They will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. He will send out his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. Jesus says, my return will be seen by all. Jesus' first coming was hardly noticed by anybody. Born as a baby in a manger, angels simply alerting the shepherds, a star pointing for the Magi to come. But he came into this world the first time virtually unnoticed. But Jesus' second coming will be just the opposite. Not coming as a baby born in a manger, but coming as a king riding on a white horse, coming as lightning in the sky that will be seen by all. All the tribes of the earth will see him. There's not going to be any question of whether or not this is true. You know, today it's so hard to believe what we see on the news. Is it real? Is it fake? Is it doctored? There's not going to be any question about fake news when Jesus returns. Everyone will be able to see it. And the Bible says that on that day, every knee will bow and every tongue will confess that Jesus is Lord. We must all agree that when Christ returns, it will be unmistakable. The second place we must have unity, I think, is to believe that Christ's promises are unbreakable. Christ's promises are unbreakable. Jesus speaks here, again, words of prophecy, and at least some of the words of prophecy are very clear. He said in the very beginning of chapter 24 that this temple is going to one day be destroyed. Not even a stone's going to be on top of a stone. Well, guess what? That came true. You know, in the Bible, you were supposed to test a prophet. If what the prophet said came true, you could believe that it was a true prophet. But if what the prophet said did not come true, this was a false prophet. Jesus is more than a prophet, but he is a prophet, speaking the word of God. And he says something really clearly is going to happen. This temple is going to be destroyed, and it happened. Jesus' prophecy came true, and I think in part he did that so that we would know that his promises are true, that what he has said will come to pass. And Jesus says this is really important because he says in verse 35, heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. In other words, everything in this world is going to change at some point. I mean, everything is going to be shaken. There's going to be natural disasters and there's going to be wars. There's going to be elections and overthrows of power. And one day, all things are going to be made new in such a way that heaven and earth will pass away. But guess what? The word of God will stand forever. Jesus' promises will not pass away. His words are a firm foundation for us to build our lives upon. His promises are unbreakable. And here's why we need to be reminded of that truth. Because I think most people in our world today would encourage us to question the promises of Jesus. In fact, the Apostle Peter said that this was going to happen. 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 4. Peter says, they will say, where is the promise of his coming? For ever since the fathers fell asleep, all things are continuing on as they were from the beginning of creation. Peter said, people are going to look at you and say, where's Jesus' return? You really still believe in those promises? I mean, the world's been progressing and evolving for 2,000 years. I mean, if you were really to go out and tell people at your workplace, in your neighborhood, that your hope is built on Jesus returning, that your hope for all things in the world is that he's going to come back and make all things new, people would probably think that you're crazy. Probably think that you're just maybe wishing, but not founded on anything in reality. Jesus says, when the world tries to make us question it, we need to believe that his promises are unbreakable. So where must we have unity? The fact that when he returns, nobody's going to miss it. It's going to be unmistakable. That his promises, his word is true. They are unbreakable. And then lastly, the timing of Christ's return is unknowable. Jesus really wants to stress the fact that no one knows the day that he will return. Now, of course, he gave signs. I believe some of those signs were to point to the destruction of Jerusalem that was coming. Of course, I think we have signs that we could know that Jesus' word is still true and that he is going to return. But his whole point is to say, no one knows. He says this really clear in verse 36. But concerning that day and hour, no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father only. Some people really like to claim that they know when Jesus is going to return. It was a little before my time, but I remember hearing stories about one person who proclaimed that there were 88 reasons Jesus was going to return in 1988. Guess what? 1988 came and went and Jesus hadn't returned, so he came out with an updated edition called 89 Reasons Jesus is Coming Back in 89. If someone claims to know when Jesus is going to return, it's an immediate red flag. If anyone tries to tell you that based on their understanding of eschatology, Jesus isn't coming back today because this has to happen, that has to happen, I believe that presents some problems. We do not know when Jesus will return. He might tarry for another 1,000 years, 2,000 years. It might be later today. We don't know when Jesus is coming back. His whole point here is not even the angels know. He says not even the Son knows. Now, allow me just a minute to help you understand that because it's really important to understanding our triune God. There is no division between the Father and the Son and the Spirit. The Bible is really clear that we have one God. We don't worship three gods who just get along really well. You know, Father, Son, and Spirit, and they're just a really good team. No, there is one God. They are one in essence, one in purpose, one in will, one in knowledge. I would say in eternity, in the Godhead, there is nothing that the Father knows, that the Son does not know, and the Spirit does not know. But what Jesus is speaking about here is not only himself as the Son of God, if you will, the second person of the Trinity, but also the Son of Man, one who is truly God and truly man, one who was born from a woman, one who had to grow in wisdom and in stature. I think in his incarnated state, Jesus is saying, even I, in my humanity, do not know. I don't believe he is saying there's any division in the triune God as to this knowledge, but he's saying in this incarnated state, it's not like Jesus could have gone off and told somebody in secret, when he was going to come back. He is saying no one knows except for God. So the question is, well, then what do we do with this? If there's a lot of confusing information maybe about the details of timing and events, and then there's some really clear things about his return, what's actually the application? And we're going to begin it today, and it's going to really pick up next week. So I hope you'll come back next week as we look into Matthew 25, and Jesus continues to speak about the ways that we apply this to our lives. But let us see the beginning of the application even here at the end of chapter 24. Jesus, after he says that no one knows, he says in verse 37, for as were the days of Noah, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Now just pause right there. What might you expect Jesus to say next? He says it was just like the days of Noah will be just like the days when Jesus returns. I don't know about you, but when I think of the days of Noah, I think about how bad the world was. I think about the wickedness and the violence that God said, I'm going to bring my judgment upon all people. But that's not exactly what Jesus brings out here. Listen as he continues on. He says, for as in those days, before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day when Noah entered the ark. And they were unaware until the flood came and swept them all away. So will be the coming of the Son of Man. Yes, it was a wicked and sinful time, but that's not what Jesus points to. Jesus points to the normal everyday life, the way that people were just continuing on, unaware of the judgment that was about to come. I think one of the greatest warnings that we need to be aware of, we do need to be aware of the wickedness and the evilness of our times, but we also just need to be aware of the normal everyday life that might distract us from what is going to take place. He says how quick it will be. 2 men will be in the field, verse 40. 1 will be taken and 1 left. 2 women will be grinding at the mill. 1 will be taken and 1 left. See, they're just consumed in everyday normal activities. Therefore, stay awake, for you do not know on what day your Lord is coming. So what is the application of all this? Well, the first part is to stay awake. Jesus makes it really clear here. The whole point that he wants his disciples to know is to stay awake. One thing, again, we'll see it more next week, but Jesus makes it really clear that his coming is going to be delayed longer than what people expect. But when it happens, it's going to be quicker than anyone would have ever expected. Jesus says, don't let his delay lull you to sleep. Don't let this time in between lull you to sleep. And notice again what Jesus is describing whenever he tells the people to stay awake. He's describing, again, the everyday life, the eating and drinking and marrying and giving in marriage. And he's describing being in the field and grinding at the mill. I think one of the things that is most concerning to us, or should be more concerning to us, I think, about staying awake is just the normal everyday life that tends to consume us. The busyness of this temporal world that takes our focus away from the eternal realities. The pressing physical nature of things that draws our mind away from the spiritual world that is all around us. Jesus says, you are going to be tempted to this spiritual slumber. Just in the way he talked about last week of being led astray and your heart and your love growing cold. I think your love growing cold is another way of speaking about you going into a spiritual slumber. Jesus says, as you get consumed with those things at work and those things at school, it is lulling you to sleep spiritually. As you look ahead to that next accomplishment or that next vacation or whatever's on the horizon, it is distracting you from the big picture of eternity. As you go through the difficult seasons or the easy seasons, as you get distracted by the things of this world, scroll on your phone or binge watch shows or whatever you might do, he says all these things are lulling you to sleep. So the call here is to stay awake. It's not necessarily to stay as busy as possible. In fact, as busy as possible might be what's calling us to fall asleep. He's calling us to be awakened to the realities that he's speaking about. It's to be ready for his return. We talked about last week the way that gathering with other Christians can help fan the flame of our love for God. I think in the same way, we can help each other stay awake as we await Jesus' return. Again, we'll talk about this more next week, what it means to stay awake. But along with staying awake, Jesus calls his disciples to stay faithful. Jesus goes on to speak about what it looks like, I think, for someone to enter into this spiritual slumber, the way that it shows up in their actions. And so he tells this story, and we'll end here. He gives this example. He's going to tell parables in chapter 25, but he says, well, who then is the faithful and wise servant, whom his master has set over his household to give him their food at the proper time? Blessed is that servant whom his master will find so doing when he comes. Truly, I say to you, he will set over him all his possessions. He says, to the one who is about the master's business, the master's return will be good news. He will reward him. He will give him over all of his possessions. But if that wicked servant says to himself, my master is delayed, and begins to beat his fellow servants and eats and drinks with drunkards, the master of that servant will come on a day when he does not expect him, and at an hour he does not know, and will cut him in pieces and put him with the hypocrites. In that place, there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Jesus speaks here about a servant who sees that his master's not coming back, it seems, anytime soon. And so he begins to act however he wants. And I don't think Jesus is saying that people are always going to go and get drunk and beat up people. I think what he's saying is when you're not living according to the master's plan, when you're not doing what the master has called you to, when you're not about his business, this is essentially what you are doing. You are abusing the resources that he's given you. You are abusing the people that he's placed around you if you're not doing what he has called you to do. And so Jesus says, my people are to stay faithful. That when I return, it should be a glorious day that we've been singing about. I mean, you'll notice that so many of our songs are about Jesus' return and the resurrection. That day will be glorious to the people that know Jesus and long for his return, because on that day, we will see him face to face. Well, on that day, he will gather us as his people. On that day, he will wipe away every tear from our eyes, and he will remove all pain and all suffering and all mourning and all sin. For those that know Jesus and serve him, we long for the day of his return. But Jesus ends this with a really hard word of judgment, because he wants us to know that his return is going to be not good news for those who do not know him. He had spoken to the hypocrites in chapter 23, and now he says, for those who do not follow me, those who do not serve me faithfully, my return will be a time of judgment, just as it is for the hypocrites, for these that do not know me. And this is what compels us to go out and to share the good news of King Jesus, to go out and tell people that he has come and he will one day return, so that less and less people experience his judgment, and that more and more people can long for this day when he returns. So as we consider all these things, they're not just abstract truths or ideas to debate about amongst Christians. They are clearly teaching us as God's people to stay awake, to not be lulled to sleep by the things of this world, and to stay faithful, be about his mission, doing the things that he has called us to do, sharing his truth and his love with those whom he's placed around us. And that is how, as we're going to see next week, we wait well for our King to return. Would you pray with me?